command line, or YAML file. In this video, we're going to be talking about imperative Kubernetes and declarative Kubernetes. Imperative is where we use the command line to do stuff, and we do things like kubectl create, kubectl apply, kubectl delete, or everything else really that you can do. We're also going to talk about declarative Kubernetes, which is where we write a YAML file out and then use kubectl to apply that YAML file to the cluster essentially to create things. Now, we can create a lot of stuff using imperative, but we can't create everything. Declarative, we can create everything using the YAML files. Plus, to be honest, this is something you're going to need to know how to do on the exams when and if you decide to do them. Speaking of exams, I just passed my CKS exam last weekend. Happy days. So yeah, certified Kubernetes security specialist sat right here now. I actually came out of it and I spoke to my wife and basically told her that I thought I'd failed. It was one of those things where I knew if it was only the question I got wrong, not wrong, but messed up on, which I knew I'd done, but in the moment I couldn't figure out why I'd done it. After reflecting on it, I realized I'd actually just set one parameter wrong in the API server. You know, these things happen, so be it. It was to do with auditing. I'd set it up a million times before, and for some reason that one time I messed it up, but it's fine. It's cool. The other one was something I just ran out of time on. I didn't get around to it because I spent so much time trying to fix that API server, and it was on Trivy, and I had to basically scan a pod. That was it. You know, I won't go into the details of it because obviously I'm not allowed to. That I know how to do. Again, done it a million times before, but for some reason, because I ran out, messed up on the API server, I never got time to go and do that question. So I think there was one other thing as well around container scanning, which, to be honest, I wasn't actually sure what they were even asking me. The question they asked me, I sat there and went, I literally have never heard of this before. I don't know what you're talking about. So we'll just skip past on that. Those three questions, I knew if it was only those three I messed up on, I should have got a certain score. And that score is what I came out with. So I know everything else went well, essentially. So yeah, happy days. Got that sorted now. Enough about that anyway. Let's get into the video. Okay, so here we are in the terminal. And just to show you where we are, I'm going to do kubectl, get pod, and I'll get all of them just to show you. So this is the cluster we set up before. It's the Cilium cluster, the last one I did, and the highly available one with etcd separated out. Now, don't worry about all these restarts. It's just because I'm running this in VMs and the VMs go up and down and every single restart of the pod is logged. So that's why you're seeing all of them. Anyway, here we are and we're ready to start going forward. So we're talking about imperative and declarative configurations here. Imperative is where we use the command line, as I just did then. And declarative is where we write YAML files out and deploy them to the cluster. So there's two approaches we can do. So let's just go through a few quick commands just to kind of get us going on the imperative side. And then afterwards, we'll look at declarative. Imperative, let's have a look. We've got kubectl and then -help. In here, we've got a bunch of stuff we can do. We can create things, expose things, run things, set things, and all this other good stuff we can see here. We've also got this little bit at the bottom here to see what extra stuff we can do. Well, kubectl something help. Pretty much what I've just done now without the something in terms of commands. So I could do kubectl create -help. And I've also got this kubectl options command here. So if I run that, this will give us a load of global flags that we can apply to something. So for example, when I do kubectl get pod -n kubesystem, what I'm actually doing is using this global flag here of namespace. That's pretty much all it is. So you can see there's the shorthand and the long form of it. Not all of them have shorthands, but a number of them do, the more common ones, let's say. And there'll be a few things in here that you might want to get used to. So you've got this as, which allows us to impersonate a user. We can specify a particular cluster, a particular context, a particular kubeconfig we want to work with. If you want to, rather than having to switch context all the time, you can directly reference one. And then there's a few other things that you'll see in here too. To be honest, most of these you probably won't use, but a number of them you will. So have a little look through and see what each one of them do. I'm not going to go through all of them here, obviously, because that would take a long time. And to be honest, yeah, that's pretty much it. There is one last thing here, this -v. This is really useful. So it shows you the verbosity of the logs. So for example, it gives you the command, the more verbose you get, the more information you get on the command. So if I do kubectl get pod, I can actually go from, I think it's somewhere like 5 to 9. And I'm not going to go through all of them here, but I'll just show you what 5 does. So v equals 5 gives us nothing. 6 gives us a little bit. And then if I just jump straight up to 9, we can see here that I get quite a bit of information. Specifically, the actual request that's being sent off. So in the background, kubectl is just running essentially HTTP requests out. So for example, I could run this curl command. Obviously, I'd need to pass in my bearer token or some sort of way of authenticating. But the idea is that this command here is actually what's being run, or one that you could run, and you'd get this information back still. So you can see if we actually just have a look, dig into this a little bit, ignoring a lot of the headers that are going through, we're actually just querying the endpoint, API, v1, namespaces, kube system, pods, give me 500. So it'll limit it to 500. So you can see there's what's going on in the background there essentially. And yeah, that's quite a useful one. If you're debugging things, it can be useful to know that one. So kubectl options, really useful command just for getting your global flags. And then kubectl, the command, and then -- help for getting more information. So let's just quickly imperatively create a pod. So we'll do kubectl. We have run, which is one of the commands we saw just a second ago when I showed you the help options. And then if we run -- help, we get a load of information again. So we get a few examples and a bunch of flags to pass in. So again, not going to go through all of it here. Have a little read into each one yourself just to get an idea of what's going on. But if we want us to run an nginx pod, we could just copy and paste this command in. So it's kubectl run nginx -- image equals nginx. And then there's a few extra ones here that gives you a few extra flags, and those flags are all right here. So we've got the image flag here, we've got ports, the container might expose, so if you want to just expose the port straight away, you can do that. And yeah, I mean let's just run one, show you an example. So kubectl run, I'll call this nginx pod example, and we'll do image equals nginx. So I'll do that, and there we go, pod nginx created. So we'll do kubectl get pod. That'll have created it in the default namespace, because by default, everything goes into the default namespace unless you specify one, which we did not. If we wanted to though, we could just do -n, some namespace. Now, if I ran this, it would actually fail because there is no namespace called some namespace. So if I wanted to create a namespace, well, there's a create command. So kubectl -- help again. Let's go up. We've got this create command. So run is running a particular image on the cluster. That's all it does. It just deploys a pod. It's not highly available. If you delete the pod, it's gone. There's no deployment to respin a new pod up in its place or anything like that. Create gives us a little bit more. So if we do create and then -- help, we can see in here, we've got a bunch of other stuff. So we've got cluster roles, config maps, deployments, ingress, jobs, namespace, all of this stuff here. Now, this isn't everything we can do in Kubernetes. It's worth noting that you can only create a certain amount of stuff imperatively. There is some things that you just have to do declaratively via a YAML file. So for example, let's say a network policy, for example, that's one thing you cannot create imperatively using the command line. You have to do that via a YAML file. Okay, so that's pretty much imperative. That's it. You're using the commands to actually just deploy stuff, but you are limited. So namespace, there it is right there. Look. So if I do create namespace -- help again, we get some examples of how to create a namespace. There is only one example because there's only one way really to create a namespace. So we can copy that. We can create the learning name. In fact, I'm not going to call it learning namespace. I'm just going to call it learning. And now I could do the run command again with -n on the end and put learning. And that will put that in the learning namespace. So if I do, you'll see me do K a lot. I've got an alias, but I'm actually doing kubectl there, so my bad. I should have explained that earlier, but yeah, if you see me type K something, I've just got an alias set up in bash. That's all it is. But kubectl get an S, so for namespace, and we can see I've got this learning namespace. And now I can do kubectl get pod in the namespace, learning. And we can see we've got that example pod running. I can then check the default namespace. I could type default, or I could just not supply one. And there it is there. So they've got 2 pods of the same name in different namespaces. If I do -A for all namespaces, I can see in here we have a pod there and the pod there. So you can see them both there. And there you go, that's the imperative. So I'd say it's worth having a look through all of them yourself. I'm not going to go through every command here because, like I say, this is kind of a bit of an overview of imperative and declarative. We'll see more about deploying things and exposing things imperatively and declaratively as we go through the series, because I want to kind of give you a good example of how things work. But this was just a quick overview. So we created some pods imperatively. Let's see if we can do them same pods declaratively. There's a couple of ways of going about this. We could we can kind of cheat a little bit with the pod thing. So if I do that command again for run pod in the particular namespace, then I can also tag onto the end of that -o for output, and I can just type YAML, and because it already exists, it's going to moan. So I'll just quickly delete that pod, and then we'll do that command again. So let's just delete that. I need to delete the pod, and then we'll go back and run that with the output YAML, and we'll put dry run equals client on the end as well to make sure it doesn't actually deploy the pod, but it will still give us the YAML output of what would be deployed. So if I run that, this is actually a YAML right here that gets deployed. So we could do that and get a base kind of example of what we should deploy. But the problem with this is, yeah, okay, pods can be deployed imperatively. But for example, like I say, the network policies cannot be deployed imperatively. So how do we know what to write in this YAML file? There's a command called kubectl explain. And that will, well, explain everything. So kubectl explain, and I can just type the word pod afterwards, or namespace, or network policy, whatever resource there is. So in terms of the resources, we can do kubectl API-resources. And this will give us every single resource we can deploy into the cluster. So all these on the left-hand side, these are all the things we can create. Now, some of them might have been deployed. So for example, when we deployed Cilium, some custom resource definitions were deployed. We'll get into them in a later video. But on the whole, this is everything by default you can deploy, excluding Cilium, like I say. So you won't see all of these under create, but you will see some of them. So it's worth knowing what you can and cannot deploy imperatively, and what you can do declaratively, which is everything. And yeah, okay, so let's not go into that too deep though, because I just want to show you how you find out the name of an API resource. So let's go back and run that explain command against pod. So if we run that, we can now see that we have a kind of pod, version v1, description, fields, API version, kind, metadata, spec, and status. So this is read only, as it says, read only. So we can't actually define the status, but we can do spec, metadata, kind, and API version. The API version is up here, v1. The kind is up here, pod, and it has to be capitalized as shown there. And then we have metadata and spec. So we can dig into those further by doing dot metadata on the end of the explain command we just did. So kubectl explain pod dot metadata. If we do that, we can see all the things that go within metadata. And if we just scroll up, we can see actually that metadata is an object, which means you should know YAML by this point, by the way. I'm not going to be teaching YAML in this, but it's a YAML object. So if we then go into that further, we can have annotations, we can set finalizers, and we can generate names or set a name. We could set namespaces, we can do labels and all sorts. Okay, so let's go back and just run that dry run again and see what we have. So we can just do a bit of a comparison about what we've just seen. So we can see there we've got an API version, a kind, the metadata with some labels, a name and a namespace, and then we have this spec, which contains containers, an image within the container, a name within the container. Okay, cool. So let's go back and do pod.spec on that explain command. And in here, see, we've got a lot of stuff we can set. So let's see if we can find that stuff. We've got containers there. Okay, we've got containers. Now we've got DNS policy and restart policy. Well, we didn't set those, so they're set by default. So we can probably ignore that for now, but we can change those. For example, DNS policies here gives you a bunch of examples of what we can set there. But one thing I want to look at is that containers, because that's an object and it's marked as required. So how do we do that? That's right, .containers on the end. So pod.spec.containers on the explain command. And in here, we've got a bunch of other stuff. So you can see it's fairly, I won't say easy to go through this, because obviously you need to kind of know what you're looking for. To be honest, the easiest way to set something like this up is to go to the Kubernetes documentation. If you go to the Kubernetes documentation and just search for creating a pod, let's just quickly do this now. So kubernetes.io/docs, I believe it is. Let's go to that. And then we can do create a pod. And by the way, you can do this in the exam. You're absolutely allowed to do this. You can do exactly what I'm doing now. We can go in, we can copy that, and then we can just dump that into a YAML file. Now I'm going to jump over to my IDE. We'll create a new file called pod.yaml, and in there, we'll go ahead and paste that in. Now, I'll just go and run this dry run one last time. Let's take a look at what the dry run does and compare it to what the website's just given us. So we've got a v1, yep, a kind of pod, the metadata, which is a name of, well, we gave it Nginx pod example, so we'll go ahead and copy that across. We also gave it a namespace, so we can set a namespace of learning. If we don't set a namespace, as with the imperative command, it will just go into the default namespace. And it also added these labels. Now, the reason it's added these labels is because if we go and expose it later with the service needs to know where to route traffic, and it will do that using labels. So that's something that will come up later in possibly the next video when I do services. I'm pretty sure I'm going to do that in either the next one or the one afterwards. Very soon anyway, they're going to come.
Yeah, they're on their way. They're still coming.
And what else did we get? Okay, we got a spec. has containers, an image of Nginx, and yeah, okay, so the website's given us a specific version. We can just delete that to get the latest version, or we can do latest on the end here. Again, I expect you to know a little bit about how Docker images and things like that work now. And let's have a look. We've got ports, container port 80. It's always a good idea that if you're exposing things via a service, to make sure you do it in the pod as well, because then when the service gets routed through to the pod, you can say, I want a service to listen on port 8443, and that 8443 port that the service exposes gets routed through to the pod on port 80. So that's a bit of port netting there. And yeah, so this is a declarative way of doing it. This is the YAML way of doing it. So let's say we've got that working now. Okay, cool. How do we apply this? So pretty simple. I'm going to get the pods in the learning namespace, and I'm going to watch that. So we'll do kubectl get pod and -n learning, and then -w for watch. So nothing will happen at the moment, and also spell learning right, that would help, but nothing will show at the moment because there's no pods in that namespace. But what I can now do, I can do kubectl apply f for file, and then just put the name of the file in. Now I can do apply, or I can do create. There is a difference between the two, which I'm not going to get into right now, but again, later video we'll cover the difference between create and apply. But yeah, I'm not going to get into that now. Again, that's going to come at a later time. But this is about imperative and declarative, the command line and the YAML way. So we'll cover them. So I'm going to use the create command. So there we go. Straight away, you saw this pop up here, started to create the container, and now that container is running. And that's basically it. Doing it via the command line is imperative. Doing it via YAML files is declarative. So that's it. That's everything for this video. We could have covered a few more commands, obviously. But if I did that, we'd probably be knocking around until the end of the year on just command videos, which, you don't want to do, I don't want to do. So, use that help command, have a little play, set up a little demo cluster, use kinda something like that, and just have a mess around. Because then if you break it, you just set it up again and go again. So, I mean, you're not going to break anything anyway, you'll be fine. So in the next video, we're going to be covering workloads, and it's another artistic video, I'm afraid. So you're going to have to put up with a little more amazing artwork from myself. I'm sure you're looking forward to that. And yeah, so we're just going to cover how deployments work, daemon sets or daemon sets, depending on how you want to pronounce that works, stateful sets, jobs, cron jobs, I think that's everything, and how replica sets fits into deployments and a little bit more. So we'll cover all that. It's going to be a pretty high level overview, 30,000 foot view or whatever you want to call it. And then we'll actually go into deploying those things. So I just wanted to give an idea of how those things fit together before just jumping straight into it and you're sat there going, what the hell is this guy talking about? Which you're probably already doing anyway, so I suppose it doesn't really matter. I'll see you in the next one.